Coming to get down. I'm coming.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Chat Night Africa. Chat Night Africa live from Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Chat Night Africa, straight talk on matters that matter. This is Chat Night Africa live. If you are heart patient, this is not a show for you. Stay off your monitoring sets. And the topic today, does Africa need the United Nations? On Chat Night Africa today, production advisor Dr. B. Tatsong from Mundam. Broadcast director Mumbalingwa. This is Chat Night, live from Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Chat Night, the power of Chat Night. Studio manager Beatrice Famonen. And my social media platforms manager and video editor in Lagos, Nigeria, Roger Full. This is Chat Night, the power of Chat Night. Does Africa need the United Nations? That's the topic on the show this week. Chat Night Africa, production assistants John Tanto, Emmanuel Nguyindi, and Lot Benson. Studio manager Beatrice Famunen. Special assistant to the presenter of Chat Night Africa, Daniel Eno. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Chat Night Africa from Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Divine and Chamakon. "75 years ago, the world saw the founding of an international organization. The United Nations, born in San Francisco in the United States on October 24, 1945, isn't being acclaimed by everyone, not in Africa. Many in Africa describe it as moribund. But what necessitated its creation in the first place? What has it here meaning United Nations, accomplished in Africa? 25 years ago, the UN could not prevent or stop the slaughter the slaughter in cold blood of 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus. The UN authorized the NATO-led attack on Libya on March 19, 2011, which resulted in the overthrow and death of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Libya is what it is today, worse than what it was before the UN-led, the NATO-led attack. So, on our show this week, does Africa need the United Nations? That's the big question. And of course, we have a lot of people who will be dialing in, and I will inform you when you can dial in and challenge our experts. If you are ready, well, let the show start. Ladies and gentlemen, On the show today, appearing for what I call the scholastic combat, Dr. Ben Bongang. Dr. Ben Bongang is professor of political science and journalism in the United States. Welcome, Dr. Ben Bongang, now on the stage.
Yeah, thank you, Divine, for having me on the show to talk about a very exciting topic that is close to me.
Thank you, Dr. Ben Bongang. I will also be having another eminent professor. He is a tough guy in this matter. That is Dr. Edu Abegano. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Dr. Edu Abegano from Togo.
Thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. This is an important topic that we all as African scholars need to be delving into and see whether Africa still need the United States, the United Nations or not. So this is an important topic, and we hope a lot of people, a lot of Africans tune in to this afternoon so that we can all have some fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Well, we will also be having Dr. Gabila Fortung, Professor of Political Science at School of Economics, Northwest University in South Africa. He will be contributing by phone. Before we get into the nooks and crannies of the matter, again, let me remind you that our phone lines will be open so that you can dial in wherever you are to challenge our speakers, members of the panel. Let's now once again welcome Dr. Ben Bongang on the platform. Dr. Ben Bongang, first question to you, sir. What in the first place necessitated the creation of the United Nations?
Divine, before I get into the reason for the creation of the United Nations, let me start provocatively by answering the question of the show today, which is, does Africa need the United Nations? My answer is yes. And I'll just give a few points to support that, and then we can get into the genesis of the UN. Africa needs the United Nations because the United Nations played a key role in the decolonization of the colonies that are today African states. Resolution 1514, I think, of 1960, that created the Decolonization Committee of the UN, played a key role in the independence of most African states in the 60s. Then, as the United Nations developed, you remember in the 80s and 90s, a series of global conferences that addressed issues from sustainable development, women's issues, human rights, and you name it. These were global conferences that treated issues that were important, not just to the planet, but to African countries in particular. One of the agencies, the specialized agencies of the United Nations, the United Nations Environment Program based in Nairobi, Kenya, is another example of how important the African continent is, not only to the United Nations as an organization, but to the world. Another example is the Economic Commission for Africa, which is another United Nations initiative to focus on economic and social development on the continent. That is a couple of things to think about. And these specialized agencies, and we'll talk a lot about some of them later, are, to me, the reason why Africa, and not only Africa, the rest of the world, need the UN. Let's go to the question then, the genesis. Why was it necessary to create an international organization, the United Nations? It was necessary because at the end of the wars of, that's the First World War and the Second World War, it was imperative for the world to find strategies to preventing a possible Third World War. The idea of creating an organization that will bring together the countries of the world to sit around tables and probably diffuse the tensions that usually led to war was a very important important reason. And Woodrow Wilson, the American president who had suggested the creation of the League of Nations, that did not work. It was still that very idea of a global institution that would help bring peace. So 75 years on, we can say that we haven't had a third world war. In your intro, you indicated some of the issues, especially security issues on the continent. We can debate those, but indeed, it was important that a global organization be created to prevent wars by creating avenues for discussions, avenues for promoting peace.
This is Chat Night Africa, and my first guest to see is Professor Ben Bongang. Ben Bongang is Professor of Journalism and Political Science in the United States. Dr. Ben Bongang, you talked about the United Nations playing a major, a cardinal role in the decolonization of Africa. Tell me, in what ways? Because already we are seeing, some people are saying that yes, they played that role, but that role is being criticized as just, African countries erecting flag independence, what they call flag independence, not economic independence. And if that's the case, why should Africans celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations?
I think we could think of a metaphor of saying, okay, because parents brought a child to the world, if that child grows up to be a problem, therefore the idea of bringing that child to the world was wrong. No, the decolonization was necessary because most of the colonies that are today African states, most of them were passing through very difficult times. The European powers, exhausted from the Second World War, some of them could no longer afford to hang around the African states. So the process of decolonization was also a process of helping these new countries figure out, how do you write a constitution? How do you figure out organizing a state? So those fundamental elements of creating a country were important. And I think that's where the United Nations played a role in the birthing, as it were, in the coming to existence of these sovereign states. International law that became very prominent at the beginning of this period, the post-1945 period, was also important. These countries needed to have the sovereign rights to exist, and the United Nations was therefore playing this role of an institution welcoming new states into the community of nations, as it were. And the fact that the United Nations General Assembly, where the new states became members, it gave them some standing in global affairs. They could sit side by side with those countries that existed already, the powers that be in Europe and elsewhere, and speak their issues, talk about their problems, and be part of international relations. And I think that's where the United Nations has been very important in welcoming the new African states to play a role in global affairs.
To play a role in global affairs, Dr. Ben Bongang, how can you explain how effective African countries can play this role? You're finding some African countries with a population of 1.5 million, Gabon, I think is one. You can have small countries like the Gambia. You have other small countries. How effective can these small countries play that role in the same room with countries like China?
Yeah, it depends on
countries like China, the United States, and so on. How is that possible? I mean, you're talking, it's like an elephant functioning in the same room as an ant. How do you explain that, sir?
And that is exactly the raison d'etre of the United Nations. That countries should, once you are a sovereign state, you are a state. Whether you are a state of 10,000 people, you are a state. recognized by international law as such, which gives you strong standing. It depends on what we mean by effective. The fact that you have standing as a sovereign state means that you can play a role, you have a voice. Remember that this is the period at the UN where during the fall season, where you have delegates from everywhere coming in. The United States makes a speech representing one country. Gabon makes a speech, represent an Equatorial Guinea. Small states make speeches. And by the way, the United States has one vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations, just like Equatorial Guinea has one vote. So it was an attempt in that scenario to give all states that belong in this organization an idea that they too are part of the system. And I may add that I had the unique opportunity of working at the United Nations in New York in the UN radio. And one of the programs that I produced was called UN Africa. It was an opportunity for me to interview the big players who are participating in issues that concern Africa. And if I may, one of my guests on the show was Mrs. Sirleaf, Mrs. Ellen Sirleaf, who went on to become the president of Liberia, the first female president on the continent. And at the time when I talked to her, it was 1993 summer. She was the director of the UN Development Program. That was one of the few African women playing a global role within an agency of the United Nations. And that goes to answer the question that that we have for the show today. How important is the United Nations for Africa? And you see people like Mrs. Sirleaf, who played a role in running important agencies of the UN, going on to be leaders on the continent. So we can look at
when you sit in the General Assembly, you're talking about one country, one vote. That sounds very democratic.
Mm-hmm.
Diplomatically, perfect. But look at the composition of the Security Council. You have 15 members of the Security Council, and then you have another club of friends, because that's how people dismiss it to be a club of friends. That's the 5 permanent members of the United Nations. Dr. Benbongan, that's exactly where the problem is.
I don't see it as a problem, because
why isn't it a problem?
We've got to be realistic. It's true that I am of those who would like to see an expanded Security Council, expanded in the sense that this post-war the victors of the war, who gave themselves veto powers as they charted the UN Charter. That's what victors of wars do. When you win a war, you get the spoils. And in creating the United Nations, you would be surprised if they created the United Nations and gave themselves the same role like every other state. They were creating an organization of victors of the war. And they gave themselves this important role because they saw themselves as the guardians of the new international order which was being created. So 75 years later, of course, it is time to begin to rethink and discuss substantively what are some of those issues. Some of them you hinted at with your intro that need to be reviewed. There is no organization that after 75 years would still function effectively the way it was conceived. It is a different world today. The United Nations was conceived during the period we call the Cold War, where the 2 superpowers at the time, the Soviet Union and the United States, were competing at every level, competing in developing lethal weapons that could destroy the world several times over, competing ideologically, one promoting socialism, communism, the other democracy around the world. And it became very important when you look at how they were courting, trying to get these new countries, those who will be socialist, those who will be democratic. So it's a very interesting period in world affairs. And it is we cannot talk about the United Nations without talking about this Cold War context.
Thank you, Dr. Ben Bongang. I'd like us, when I say us, including Professor Edu Abegano of Togolese origin, who is now on the screen, I'd like us to listen to the contribution from Dr. Gabila Fortung, who is a political science scholar at School of Economics, Northwest University in South Africa. Dr. Gabila is on the line.
Good evening, Bad Divine, and good evening to your listeners, and thank you very much for having me on your show. I think this is a very interesting question. Does Africa need the United Nations? And without having the benefit of listening into your introductory remarks and getting a sense from which the different panelists would want to address this question, just permit me to explore it very broadly. And to be able to say that my answer is a definite yes to that question, and I'll explain from a number of perspectives. Number one, the United Nations is a sort of barometer for international norms and values within the context of the very many young and evolving democracies on the African continent. United Nations becomes a point of reference towards which commitments can be made for the respect of human rights, and a number of international conventions can be drawn in a range of areas on environmental protection, climate change, even in the aspect of child education, girl education, like UNICEF, questions around peace and security, with the responsibility to protect operations, and the whole standards setting and norms by which certain governments action can be judged. Now, that is one of the contributions of the UN system to definition of global norms and global standards of the sanctity of life, of respect for human rights. Now, for those of us who come from Africa and the African continent, you're going to realize that sometimes those global norms and standards, even though some governments pay only lip service to it, they become the deterrent from allowing certain governments to go rogue on their citizens. So this is the UN then and its systems then pose as a kind of norm barometer to say these are the standards by which you shall rule your people, and the eye of the world is watching. So you cannot just do what you want. And you would have noticed, like in the context of Cameroon, with the ongoing crisis in the southern Cameroon, that every time we are getting towards December, the government of Cameroon, for example, starts taking certain steps to try and demonstrate to the rest of the world that it is paying attention to its human rights records. So that is where you have a UN system acting as a norms barometer, because there's at least a space and an instance somewhere where they would be challenged for their actions. They'll be asked questions. They'll be asked. They'll be challenged for the way they are managing people, and so it provides an added incentive. Ask yourself the question: if you take away that incentive, you give room to anarchy, and governments that are not naturally inclined to be responsible then can go rogue. And so yes, the UN systems then becomes a positive influence. The same applies to incentive for development planning and management and implementation, with the targets that were set with the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, this serves as incentives for planning and encouraging African administrations to manage by objective, something which has not been which most countries have not been repeated to doing. So because they are brought into a system whereby they're expected to accomplish or commit to accomplish certain targets in a range of sectors with specific indicators, the number of governments that do not have own capacity to manage development, which are a number of them in Africa, can then commit the administrations to attempt to meet that goals. Now, it is argued that within the context of weak public management, the ability to be able to have objectives by which you can manage your public sector and want to meet your social and economic objectives provides an incentive for you to manage by objective. And which is something for which the UN can take credit, from the Sustainable Development Goal perspective. A number of the agencies also have very specialized skills. United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, United Nations Development Program, Industrial Development Organization, and a range of these UN system organizations do carry out specialized research, which from an African policy formulation perspective is very important, because they tend to provide what you may want to assumed to be the more objective analysis of some of the developmental challenges on the African continent, because they, unlike their sister organizations like the World Bank and the IMF or even the African Development Bank, they do not have a board of shareholders to please. So if you look at it within the African integration system, and the whole African unity from the OE to the AU, and the functioning of continental governance as it is on Africa, you go up to Addis, you're going to realize that it is the trio of the African Development Bank, the African Union Commission, and United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. The United and that actually drives the narrative and the agenda of African integration and development. In this case, the UNECA acting as a technical partner, which actually devotes the resources to conduct real research that is relevant for Africa. I do understand that there are sometimes negative sentiments about the functioning of the UN as an entity, and I think more often than not, this happens to be related to the UN's image that is around the power structure within the Security Council, and particularly the power of the permanent members and the use of their veto powers, and whether they use this rightfully or wrongfully to advance their own foreign interest agenda. Now, that is a reality that is being addressed within the context of the demands for UN, the reform of the UN systems. And I would say from the perspective of Africa that Africa should rather add its voice to that request for reform, and a request to get a permanent seat on the Security Council to reflect its demographic contribution to the world, as at now. But that is not an argument in itself that will be given on an altruistic basis. I personally am of the view that Africa is only going to get a permanent seat on the Security Council the minute it becomes an economic and a military power. Now, should Africa stop appreciating in its engagement with the UN before that happens? No. I think it's work in progress, and we must see the UN as an imperfection that we have to learn to live with while we make it work for our own needs in the short and the interim. I have to stop. Let me stop the voice note now.
Thank you, Dr. Gabila Fortung, Professor of Political Science at the School of Economics, Northwest University in South Africa. Dr. Ben Bongang, I have some pointed questions for you concerning what Dr. Gabila just said, especially at the tail end of his analysis. Then I'll bring on back Professor Edu Abegano. Dr. Ben Bongang, do people who describe the United Nations as moribund have a point, especially Africans?
I think moribund is too strong a word. Moribund is almost apocalyptic, as if it was dead. No, as Professor Fortung said, he listed, as I had said earlier, a number of very important initiatives and actions that the United Nations is concerned and actively engaged with on a daily basis in the continent and elsewhere. I think the critics of the UN who have valid points are often thinking more of the UN as some entity that could come in and stop fights when there are fights. No, the UN, like every organization, is as good as its membership. That means the members have to agree to take action for action to be taken. And in most of these cases, those who criticize the UN criticize it for failure to act and to act promptly when there are crises in places. The reason is obvious, as Dr. Fortung underscored there. If the permanent members, any one of them, does not want anything to be done, all they do is have their veto and nothing will be done. And in most cases, especially during the period of the Cold War that I talked about, it was ideological tensions around the world. And if, let's take hypothetically, if there was a problem in an African country, and it is one of those countries either supported by the Soviet Union, of course, the UN cannot go intervene, and the Soviet Union will agree to that kind of resolution. They will veto it, and vice versa with the United States. So some of them see that inability to act and to act promptly as one of the major problems of the UN system. And it is really a problem. But I think the world and the critics of the UN tend to give it so much role than it was really created for. The UN cannot solve all global problems. Global problems must be solved by starting within states. Some of the civil conflicts within states can only be solved effectively by the citizens of that country. So to imagine that a global organization will come and be knowledgeable enough to end family quarrels in African states would be to give it more power than it actually can muster. So the United Nations is not equipped with the means to solve those kinds of problems. Now, when you, just to wrap that up, when you look at most of the conflicts, when they've been solved or addressed by military means, it is always probably a resolution of the United Nations, but then the real boots on the ground are by the powerful states, such as the United States and the coalitions that they might come from with Europe. The UN does not have a military force that can solve these problems.
Thank you, Dr. Ben Bongang. Now we are getting into the area of the United Nations involving itself in conflict management overseas, especially in Africa, peacekeeping missions. I have an expert in the area, Sir Professor Edu Abegano of Togolese origin. You are an expert in conflict management, international conflict management, peacekeeping, and so on. I mean, you have written extensively, given conferences like Ben Bongang extensively on this issue. In Cameroon, when the armed insurgency began in 2016 into beginning of 2017, Anglophone Cameroonians were looking up to the United Nations. They thought at some point, there were rumors that the United Nations was going to send peacekeeping forces to Cameroon. Some even thought that the peacekeeping, the forces were going to eject Paul Biya from power. In Rwanda 25 years ago, almost 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered in cold blood. The invasion of Libya that led to the overthrow and death of Muammar Gaddafi left Libya what it is today, a heaven for terrorism. You have to have other arguments, Dr. Edo, to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations as in Africa. Do you really, 75th anniversary as an African, do you really have good reasons to pop the champagne?
Thank you so much for giving me the floor, and it's very important. I don't want to repeat my predecessors. To delve into this issue or this discussion, we first of all have to call out the missions, the purposes of the United Nations. Those purposes are around four main points. First and foremost is to maintain international peace and security. That is the whole idea when it comes to the United Nations. And UN have been doing a lot of work around that. The argument that we scholars in the academia, we have been making all the time, you have to have a peace before you can maintain it. If there's no peace, there's no maintenance. So that's the problem with the United Nations. for the peacekeeping missions, you have to have a ceasefire before we can try to see how to mediate between the protagonists of conflict and war. Like you said, in 2016, in Cameroon, for example, when that is anti-government uprising, and the people of Cameroon, the Cameroonians, were expecting all of a sudden the manna to be thrown to them. They were expecting the United States to start doing something for them. This is a laughable wording. Why I'm saying that? Because every countries, every nation state, as Dr. Bongen just said, have what is called national sovereignty. When it comes to national sovereignty, no country, no external actors, whether it's state actors or non-state actors, have any right to interfere in the internal affair of the other countries or the other nation. With that being said, if Cameroon does not invite, the Cameroonian government does not invite the United Nations, they will not come. That is what the United Nations started in the early on of its mission. But our late Kofi Annan, that is one of the former UN Secretary General, said that state cannot hide behind that notion of national sovereignty and be abusing, killing, assassinating its people. Because of that, they come up with a formula known as R2P. That means responsibility to protect. The United Nations now has the responsibility to protect the civilian when there's a gross abuse of human rights. So the UN have to come up with the definition, what constitutes gross abuse of human rights before it can intervene. And when it comes to talking about war and peace issues, it's not the 194 or 195 countries, including the Sudan, that is a membership of the United Nations, will intervene to or will make a resolution to allow intervention in a certain country or in a Cameroon. It's up to the UN Security Council. Again, my predecessor talked a lot about that already. The Security Council, member states of the Security Council, especially the P5, the 5 permanent members of the Supreme Council, have veto power. And those countries are the powers that govern the whole world. They have to have some kind of an interest before they can intervene, before they can send UN peacekeepers in Cameroon or in any country for that matter. So if any of those countries, I mean China, United States, France, UK, and Russia, if any of them or all of them do not have any interest in Cameroon, just forget about it. All countries, especially the P5, behave based on their national interest, their self-interest.
I'm going to ask you
people
this.
Will say,
yes, go ahead.
Yeah, people will say you have a France that have an interest, that is a former colony of former colonial master of Cameroon, Cameroon who may have interest. The interest is a bind with the government. France's interest is not Cameroonian, it's the government. France is the country that is holding Biya in power. So if France intervene on behalf of the Cameroonian people, the front government will mess up its own national interests. So
how
those
can you
leaders,
yes, sir. How can you explain that 25 years ago, almost 1 million Tutsis and moderate Hutus were slaughtered and the United Nations functioned in New York as though nothing was happening? How can you explain that?
Yeah, that is very important. Remember, before the Rwanda genocide, you have the issue in Somalia, where the American soldiers were, embarrass, drain on the floor, pee on, and so on and so forth. And during that time, you have Clinton, Bill Clinton in power, and nothing has been done, and it's kind of shameful to the American people, people and American government. And when time comes for Rwanda, they don't want to have anything to do with African anymore, because we shame them by killing their troop, by dragging their troop on the floor, and so on and so forth. They don't have anything to do anymore with African or any African country. And you know that United States is one of the P5. And if US did not want to do anything, and all the 4 remaining P5 US alone, United States alone, can veto that resolution, and nothing can be done. There's no intervention. So that's the main issue. That is the main explanation why the world was watching or have been watching Rwanda genocide, killing almost some literature say 800,000. Some people say, some literature say 1 million. Whatever the number may be, one death is already a lot. So talking about 800 to 1 million is a lot. So because the interest is not there, and nobody wants to call that a genocide. In the UN Charter, if a country calls an event happening in a country a genocide, that country have to do something about it. No country was willing to call when the slaughter, the killing, the mass killing was happening. Nobody want to do anything about it. That's the same thing happened in Sudan, and they are not calling a genocide. They call it a mass killing, and so on and so forth.
Well,
and the main issue with the United Nations is not only reacting to what's going on. The problem that some who are critical about the United States, about the United Nations, is the lack of prevention. The lack of prevention. So we have to move from responsibility to protect to responsibility to prevent. That's where African people, not African government leaders, but African people needed the United Nations. They need it very crazily because our leaders are failing us. They fail us, they are failing us, and if we let things go the way it's going, they are going to continue to fail us. African people have to stand up with one voice to call on the United Nations to continue using the word prevention in the Charter. That is a one. To take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threat to the peace. So threat to the peace is not only threat to the peace of the United States or to Russia, to that any country that is a member of UN as a global organization, any threat there is a threat to all.
Okay, thank you.
So they have to be able to define that.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Let me bring back Dr. Ben Bonga. Professor, as an African, are you proud of the work that the United Nations sanctioned in Libya, the NATO-led attack, which led Libya in the mess that we have it today? Because and I ask you this question because you actually, in your opening statements, were celebrating the existence of the United Nations. So that's why I ask you the question. So,
yeah, as I emphasized at the beginning, when we look at what is positive about the United Nations, as I said, when you look at the specialized agencies of the UN and the work that they are doing around the world, including in Africa, and I think Professor Fortung also talked about them, the UNICEF, the UNEP, UNDP, and all the others, they are doing work on a daily basis. When it comes to security matters, and I think Professor Edo just underscored that, it is the powers that be in global affairs function because of national interest. When you see in the case of Libya, the forces in Libya were not the United Nations forces. They were a resolution, when it is accepted at the UN, means it has to be implemented. And the P5, the permanent members, are going to figure out how to execute that plan. And they will only execute the plan based on their interests. So that's the reality in global politics, or in politics in short. Politics is about power.
Do you call that hypocrisy?
No, it's not hypocrisy. We are realists. The world is made up of the strong and the weak, and the strong will successfully defend their interests, unlike the weak. And in the case of Libya, and in other cases where international bodies have intervened, whether you look at Iraq or in Afghanistan, it has always been because the members of the P5 had vital interests at stake. And when they do, they are going to do everything in their power for it to succeed. Now, if we want to reform the UN, the P5 have to accept that reform. And there won't be any reform if the P5 does not accept.
And do you think that they're in any mood to accept it?
At the moment, I don't see that it is in their interest. It works well the way it is for them. So the point I'm making is that it is not whether we like it or not. That's the reality. The reality in power politics is that the stronger will always dominate.
What was the purpose of the 15-member non-permanent member council in the Security Council? You have the General Assembly, you have the 15 underlining that non-permanent. Yeah. What was the purpose of the non-permanent members, sir?
Yes, I think that was, and I'm not very conversant with the details of the negotiations to get the membership. You know, it is revolving. Countries take turns.
It's 2 years, two-year term.
But as you can imagine, that was a concession that was given by the P5 reluctantly, because an exclusive club is an exclusive club. They don't want new members. So the concession was to say, let's have these other members who are not permanent. They rotate, but they will have a word around the table. We enlarge the discussion of security matters, of important global affairs. We listen to them. But at the end of the day, it is the P5 who will accept if there is a resolution to act. You know, so that's the reality of global affairs.
Therefore, the non-permanent members of the Security Council just sit there and probably have coffee watching the P5 decide what they want to decide.
Well, I since I've not been privileged to sit around them, I know that when they do contribute in the discussion, and that's about what they can do.
And then probably contribute in drafting out some statements.
Yes, the resolutions
doesn't mean much.
I mean, as I was saying, well, it was interesting when I was at the UN in New York to see all these negotiations, and when all delegates from different countries come and play their part. I see that the advantage as I see in that is that at least you have a community of nations coming together and hearing each other out. But when it comes to resolving issues of war and peace, it is the Security Council and the people.
This is Chat Night Africa, and in a moment, we will be bringing back on the stage Professor Ben Bongan. My name is Divine Nchamuka. Chat Night Africa from Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And you can now pick up your phone and dial the number 240-603-7367. Again, 240-603-7367. On the show today, we have Professor Ben Bongang, Professor of Political Science and Journalism. We also have Professor Edo Abegane of Togolese origin, Professor of Political Science, Specialist in International Conflict Management. I'm bringing all of them now to the stage. That way you can ask your questions as they take mine. I'm going to ask both of you, sirs, what would you say has been the extent or the efficacy of the United Nations Security Council in peacekeeping missions in Africa? Maybe Dr. Ben Bongang first.
I think in a very general way, the fact that you have missions, several peacekeeping missions in different countries of conflict, that would be an example that it has taken initiatives in at least sending multinational forces to these conflict zones. And
1 second, sir. Just hold it there. We have a call from Africa. Hello there, Jerry Johnny.
Hello, good evening. This is Jerry Johnny. I'm calling from the beautiful city of Rio in Nigeria.
Yes, please. What's your question?
All right. Okay. Boko Haram is a top tier threat to Africa, and I think everybody will accept this. The group is most active in northern Nigeria, in northern Cameroon, in Chad, and of course in Niger. The UN Security Council imposed economic sanctions and arms embargo on the insurgent group in 2014. So my question is, what is the effect, the positive result of the UN action? Or shall I say or ask, what way is the UN helping Africa to fight insurgency and insecurity?
Thank you, sir. Yes. Yes, Dr. Ben Bongang?
Well, I don't know the details of what has been done with regards to Boko Haram, but I would answer it in a very general way. Yeah, Boko Haram is a non-state actor. That means Boko Haram doesn't belong to a state. And any attempt to deal with non-state actors is fraught with problems. Because when you deal with states, you have a government, you have leaders that you can consult. So with Boko Haram or any other group, non-state actor, until you identify its leadership, and if that leadership is willing to come to the table, that and only then can you have a response or a possibility of a negotiations. Short of that, you will have what is happening currently, which is I think in northern Cameroon, and you have some French forces that have been assisting. You have American forces and advisors who've been assisting, I think, the government of Cameroon and maybe possibly Nigeria too, in intelligence on how to get to some of these Boko Haram people. But to expect that the United Nations can do anything effective against Boko Haram, in my opinion, would be a tall order.
Professor Edu, the question I want to ask, and I'd like you to drill down on the question, and then Dr. Ben Bongang will come in, is it comes down basically to one thing. Are Africans over-expecting from the United Nations Security Council especially?
Yes.
Are our expectations over-bloated or exaggerated?
Yes. We expect, I cannot say that we over-expect because it's a lack of information. Because we don't know that, the objective and the relationship between the UN and the states is based on sovereignty issues, because we don't know that. Is why we are over estimate. We expect too much from the UN. Again, UN does not intervene in any country if there's no humanitarian issues. A country can intervene in another country that's war and so on and so forth. But UN intervene if there's a gross abuse of human rights. And that is when UN, the governor in place, the leaders of that country, if the leader cannot handle it, is when the UN will step in to intervene on the basis of on the ground of a humanitarian basis. So we African, we need to take the issue on our hand. We need to fight our fight in our hand. Coming back to the issue of Boko Haram, for example, that is a failure of the government. It's a failure of governance and a failure of leadership in Nigeria and any neighboring country that give the rise to Boko Haram. So maybe it's a lack of inclusion in the political system. Once we have some ethnic group, some entity feel like they are left out, they are relatively deprived compared to other ethnic group, you see that those kind of revolt, those kind of terrorism activity, if we call it so. So that is a failure of our government. So for UN to come in, if those non-state actors, like Dr. Bongen said, UN intervene with government, with a state, with a government, and so on and so forth. So if those non-states messed up with their oil, for example, oil rig and so on and so forth, with their interests and so on and so forth, then they will send in some troops to come and protect their interests. They are not coming to do anything but protect their interests. So we African, we need to put some pressure on our government to take care of us so that we don't have those kind of issues. And the same issue go also when a leader in a country violates human rights. People say we are going to send him to ICC, International Criminal Court. Nobody can send any leader to International Criminal Court if that country is not a member of that International Criminal Court. You have to be a signatory of that court before a leader can be sent for abuse of human rights, for threats against humanity. So if a country is not a member, a leader will not go. A leader will not be sent to that place. So those are the things that we need to educate our people before they can raise their expectation too high without any. So if you really want UN to intervene, for example, in Cameroon, as we are speaking, you have a protest on the street all the time. The leader was arrested, some treasure and so on and so forth. The spokesperson of Mr. Maurice Kamto, yes, was arrested and so on and so forth. That's a lot of issue that the Cameroon people who want change in that country need to stand up. One person cannot bring about change. The whole country, the whole people who love peace, who love change, should stand up and bring about peace at all costs. It's that cost that will bring the UN to intervene on the ground of humanitarian. So if you are doing some protest, one person is killed like the other on the 22nd, one person is killed, and you crave foul, UN have to come in. You're just lying to yourself.
Well, the saying goes that you cannot make omelette without breaking eggs.
That's it. So you have to have an abuse of gross abuse of human rights, a crime against humanity that the UN can come in. So my only request from the UN is that UN is too reactionary. It reacts to conflict instead of prevent the conflict. So if you look at, you talk about the UN peacekeeping mission, you have in Burundi, we see what happened between the Tutsi and the Tutsi and Hutu. We have recently Ivory Coast in 2010 election. We see what happened. 3,000 people die before UN and with the help, with the demand from the France. France, as a member of UN Security Council, asked UN to intervene before UN helped the French forces to take the elected, the one who is democratically elected, Gbagbo away and bring their puppet. That's it. So country act on their interests. Talking about the non-permanent, let me make some correction over there.
Yes, sir.
We have in the UN Security Council, that is 15. 5 are permanent and 10 are rotational.
Exactly.
And
yeah, thank
10
you.
are rotational. Those 10 also have a role to play, but their role is basically minimal. Why I say that is a minimal? When it comes to war and peace issue, you have all the 5 permanent members have to agree, and
that's a tall order.
At least 4 from the non-permanent member have to add before they can go. So for the resolution to pass in the UN Security Council, you have a 9 out of 15. 9 out of 15 have to say yes, including all the 5. If we have a 10 or 14 and one of the P5, one member of the P5, the 5 permanent member say no to the resolution, nothing happened. So that veto power is a very key. It's that veto power that was lacking in the League of Nations, where we have the Second World War. But what we are asking as Africans, as scholars who want fairness, what we are asking the P5, we just want representation of Africa. We want Africa to be represented in as a one. We have one. We just need 1 seat. We don't need that much. Even though Europe is heavily represented by British and French, Asia was represented by France, by China and Russia. Some people will argue whether Russia put itself in the Europe or in Asia, but for the purpose of this study, I'm placing it in Asia. And America's heavily represented by United States. What about Africa? There's no representation. So what we are asking, because all decisions are made for Africa, and we want Africans to be at the discussion table and have that one veto power so that we can play the game also. We can have a fair share.
Dr. Ben Bonga, when the United Nations was born in San Francisco, October 1945, no African country existed as an independent country, so to speak. Could that be the source of the problem, that we got in to get along? Because basically that's what it is. You join an organization. I'm from a village in Cameroon called Bali. You from Banso. Well, there is a Bali organization. Well, we formed that organization not because of Banso people, not because of the village where Dr. Edo is from, but to take care of ourselves as Balis. Then you want to belong to that association in the name of international order, you're almost going to be dancing to the rhythm of the Bali people. Is my assessment right?
Yes, yes, that's the fact, because the United Nations, as you said, was created at the end of the war. And if I could just go back to talk about the League of Nations that Dr. Edo talked about. You know, after the First World War, Woodrow Wilson, the American president, brought the idea of the League of Nations. And it was a wonderful idea, because it had all the ideas that you needed to bring peace. But unfortunately, the League failed. Why? Because one of the most powerful nation, the father of the League itself, did not participate because of the American system of governing. Because the president, Wilson, could go to Paris, sign the Versailles Treaty, but it only becomes functional if the Senate ratifies it. The Senate, which at the time was led by isolationists, who are the core of what we call conservatives in the US today, they said no. They will not sign on to it. And creating the United Nations was not easy, because those isolationists were still fighting against the idea of international organization. Why? Because when you are a powerful state, you don't want to create a club where you bring others to reduce your power. So reluctantly, the US accepted then, because there was a Second World War, to create it. So the exclusive club, the P5, was now a guarantee that the victors of World War II will be controlling this organization. And as Dr. Edo was saying, it's all about this idea of national interest.
Okay, Dr. Bongang, I have somebody from South Africa. Let's see if we can get him on the line. That's a long distance call. Hello from South Africa. Hello.
Hi, buddy. Thank you so much for calling me, and I'm sorry for coming on late.
That's Professor Gabila Fortune. We listened to the first contributions that you made. I just had to interrupt a little bit, Dr. Ben Bongang, since you're a long distance caller. But the question I'm going to ask you is, do you think that the United Nations is of any relevance to Africa? And the reason I ask you this question is taking into consideration the fact that they wouldn't decide to do anything in any country, especially developing country, if it doesn't directly touch the interest of members of the Permanent Five. So, as an African, isn't it normal to ask you a question if that's the way business is done over there? What is in it for me? What is in it for me? Is that a legitimate question that you, as an African professor, would ask?
Well, I think that let me play the devil's advocate on this particular question. That I can't remember which French philosopher said made this statement, that l'émotion est née.
Albert Camus.
Say that again.
Albert Camus. Albert is a French. Albert Camus. Albert Camus.
Okay. So the reason I made reference to this specific statement is that, Uncle D, as African intellectuals, we need to come to terms with the realization that the world is a cold game of chess. There are no Father Christmases out there willing to hand out a just and a fair and conduct altruistic business. The world is a jungle. It's a cold jungle driven by interest and strategic engagement. So from an African perspective, we're not going to pack and go and live in mass. We need to realize the world in which we are working is driven on certain interests. And I'm going to take it from the history of economic development to say that it's like our elders say, a child who washes his hands can eat with the elders. So in the context of international diplomacy, Africa just needs to come to terms with the fact that the world is governed and overshadowed by the powerful. It is in the jungle, the lion is king. The elephant is boss. That is the way the world works. Anytime and every time people from other parts of the world hear us complain about the injustices of the international system, they laugh at us because we are trying to create a utopia that is contrary to the realities of human nature. Human reality is that the strong are going to dominate the weak. Human reality is that if you have the ability to be able to pursue your interests and manipulate internationally established systems to be able to secure your strategic interests, you do just that. Now, they have done that and they get away with it because we believe in those institutions more than they do. We need to learn to play the game. And for us, I think, yeah.
So, Dr. Gabila Fortune, what's the point of what we were celebrating, what Dr. Ben Bongang apparently was celebrating at the General Assembly, one vote, one country? From what you said, this is a charade of fairness. It's a veneer. It really doesn't amount to anything, or except you saying that, well, one man, one vote in writing resolutions and condemning things left and right.
It is. Let me put it to you this way. In the way that people will interpret the system, they will interpret you as an imperfect system. It is like somebody calling you into a negotiation table, taking out a 9mm pistol and puts it on the table and says, "Let's talk." Obviously, you have a voice; he has a voice. But there are added elements within that specific conversation that says that even though you are
like that analogy,
on
sir.
equal terms, the ability to enforce your expectations is vastly different. And of course, rich and wealthy countries have options. African countries don't have options. The question we must ask ourselves is: if we pull out of that context, which other avenues of expressions do we have? At least we can name and shame and call out the hypocrisy and point them to how well or how poorly they are meeting up their international standards. But let us not be, what is the word? Let us
naive.
Not lie to ourselves.
Right.
That let's not be naive to think that what they call equality is actually equality. There's no such thing as equality. That's why you're going to have the big players say, we will not sign up to certain things and we'll sign up to certain things. When George Bush wants to go into Iraq, he comes to the United Nations and decides that this is how we're going to do it. If they don't give him what he wants, he has an election to prepare for. He goes in anyway. He answers to the American electorate and pays lip service or commits himself to the UN to the extent that it satisfies his own domestic priorities. And by the way, he balances off his excesses by how much he commits his government to sponsor the institution, which Uncle Trump has changed in the last couple of years. So when we cry injustice, unfair, these are the people that sponsor the budget of the UN system.
The last question.
Yes.
The last question I'm going to ask you, sir, before you go is, how can Africa get out of that state of lethargy? Because it looks to me that is what it is. How do they become a power? Let me ask you this direct question. If the 5P members of the permanent members of the Security Council decided that, okay, Africa, you've been complaining, we need one seat. How do you think, one permanent member, how do you think Africa can proceed with picking a permanent member? Because I see African countries killing each other, climbing over each other to get that.
Okay, Nigi, your question is a very brilliant question. And my answer is going to be as straightforward. What is the strength of 5 permanent members? They are all nuclear powers. They have the military and the financial might to back their decisions on the Security Council. The African country that is going to find itself sitting on that table should share similar characteristics as the permanent members. But from an African continental, so they are supposed to be an economic power, and they're supposed to somewhat be a military power of sorts. Now, to expect that one of the 54 of us is going to emerge to be able to occupy that space would probably open up a long continental debate that we will not be able to solve in the immediate. On the contrary, if we have an emerging African continental integration that meets those specs, an African Union that becomes a military power in practical terms. So practically speaking, not just on isolated peace missions, but intentionally builds military capability to be able to respond to the situation and becomes a nuclear power from a continental perspective, and then becomes an economic power, it would be a lot easier for its voice to reflect on the Security Council and for it to be heard and to be respected.
My last question.
For the time being,
yes, sir.
Yes.
My last question.
Yes.
I know.
For the time being, we have. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I know you professors can talk on this. I mean, you are a repository of knowledge and matters like this.
Right.
But my last question, since we're having, I'm getting notices that by my studio director that we're having a lot of people calling, some from Canada, Georgia, and so on. My last question to you, sir, is what qualifies as genocide that would drive?
Okay, to just repeat the question. I'm losing you a bit.
Yeah, what qualifies as genocide that would trigger the intervention of the United Nations Security Council in a country, regardless of whether the leader of that country wants it or not?
Uncle D, I was going to answer that question very sarcastically. I was going to say genocide is what the P5 say it is. But on a more serious note, because there are lots of conflicts around the world, that there are international standard definitions of genocide by defined according to criteria about the number of people who are being killed, the context and the circumstance of the conflict, and so on and so forth. So there are classical standard professional definitions of what a genocide is. The question of which is a textbook can be Google defined or textbook defined. What is a genocide and what are the characteristics of a genocide? Now, the second part of your question of how does this rise up to to a priority list within the international the UN Security Council system? That's where power play politics and international diplomacy comes in, which is very briefly, you would need to have an advocate. You would need to have someone among the top 5 that sufficiently owns your matter to want to table it. It could come from the top 5, it could come from the other 10 non-permanent members, it could be presented by a member state, but they need to build a coalition of willing parties that think your matter is of such urgency, then it should be put on the table. And then, of course, unfortunately, it has to be in the context where none of the top 5 immediate strategic interest is hampered by whatever it is that is being defined as genocide. Otherwise, it'll just simply veto it. So it's a very cold-hearted, unfortunate situation where genocide should be genocide. You know, we should be able to identify the character of the conflict and say that here, what this president is doing to people is unacceptable. But in the context of Africa, we have seen it again and again, you know, where there could be vast massacres of people like some people want to say is happening in some parts of Africa at the moment. And because the strategic interest of specific members of the Security Council is directly affected, they would just connive with the entities in place to turn a blind eye to it. And actually, let me just also add, Uncle D.
Yes, sir.
Because among themselves, they would not go to war with each other for an African country. They just keep it at that. It stays suspending, you know. America is not going to go to France over any French African country, for example. They will not go to war with France for that. Because the business and the military and the economic and the volume of trade transactions between Europe and America trumps whatever interest there may be in Africa that will cause them to fight. So it's not going to happen. Same thing with China. The European Union is China's biggest trading partner. So China is not going to go to war with France over Cameroon, for example.
Thank you for that brilliant, I would say, thank you, sir. Thank you. I could go on and on. That is Professor Gabila Fortung, Professor of Political Science at School of Economics, Northwest University in South Africa. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mary, for having me, and good evening to your listeners and your panel.
Thank you. Dr. Ben Bonga, this is...
Yeah, I think it's important that we don't lose sight of the other aspects of the United Nations. It is very clear from what we've said and what Professor Fortung has said, that if we begin to look at the United Nations or assess the effectiveness or lack thereof of the United Nations based on security matters, we'll be missing a lot. I started off by listing the issues, global issues of interest to everybody in the world that the United Nations with its armies of experts around the world have tackled, whether they're human rights, sustainable development, a string of other things. And that's why it created this body of specialized agencies in every sector of global issues. So you see, we've been talking the realism of the US, of the United Nations. In other words, we've been talking about what some would call the selfish interest of the P5, the permanent five. No, some would say that is the way the world works, as I've been emphasizing. But that is a part of the United Nations that we cannot resolve now, and I don't see it being resolved in the next few years. But
we will be
the other part of it,
yes, sir.
The development work of the United Nations is what we should be emphasizing.
I'm going to ask you questions on that, sir, and questions that might be uncomfortable to some people. Now, but before we get to you, Dr. Ben Bongang, let me ask this. I have a call on the line. Let me ask Dr. Edo, how come Laurent Gbagbo found himself at the ICC? How come Charles Taylor found himself at the International Crimes Court, and other leaders, and not some? How do some people arrive there and not others?
Yes. Again, as I said before, before a leader can be sent to ICC, that country where the person is leading, or that president, or that leader, or political party leader, the country have to be a signatory member of the ICC. If the country is not a signatory member of ICC, the country does not sign off on the provision of the ICC.
It seems we're having connectivity issues. We have a call on the line. Hello.
Nobody. No, Liberia is a member.
Just hold it there, sir. Let's see. There is one Kodjo on the line. Hello. Is it Miss or Mr.?
Mr.
Okay, sir. Mr. Kodjo, what's your question?
No, I just want to participate in the debate and see how things are going. So if I have to intervene, I will, but not at this time.
Okay, thank you, sir. Yes, sir, Professor Edo. Sorry I interrupted you. I was trying to give priority to the callers.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yes, so what I'm saying, that is the one. Liberia is a member of ICC. Liberia signed ICC after ICC was created in 2002 to respond to a question related to crime against humanity. The same question can be asked whether a country like Sudanese,
that's right,
can go and Sudan does not directly sign. Al-Bashir does not directly sign that provision. But if someone does not sign the provision, it's not a member of that ICC, and the leader of that country, like Al-Bashir, go to South Africa, for example, that is a member of ICC, or come to Ivory Coast, for example, that is a member of ICC. Ivory Coast have to give Al-Bashir away to ICC because the president come to the land that is a member of ICC. That's a property of ICC. ICC can have a hold on it. The issue with Al-Bashir, when the Al-Bashir, that is the president of Sudan, North Sudan, now Sudan, now went to South Africa, but the government of Zuma that time did not want to give out arrest the president Al-Bashir and give it to ICC. So a country nobody can go to ICC if that country is not a member.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for the response. Let me bring Dr. Ben Bongang. Let me bring Dr. Ben Bongang on the stage to take this question because I'll come back to you, Professor Edo. The question I want to quickly get to Ben Bongang on is, you talked about the other things, implying the good things, or the good things that the United Nations does in Africa. Let's take COVID-19. The feeling, some critics have been thinking that it's a cut and paste thing, just because something works in the developed country or in developed countries, it isn't going to work the same way in developing countries. I take, for example, social distancing. If you look at the economic lifestyle, the social and economic lifestyles of Africans, it's not the same as those in the West. So how do you cut and paste? Is that a valid criticism of the international system? That they think that just because something works in the West, it should work the same way in developing countries? Here we're talking about Africa.
No. No, because every organization, in this case, the United Nations, as I said, the specialized agencies do work in different parts of the world and figure out solutions to problems. I think you gave the example of COVID-19. COVID-19 has surprised the world, but one can argue that the World Health Organization, with all the criticisms notwithstanding, has been doing what it's supposed to do, which is to figure out solutions to global health problems. And when there are problems, it will try to find out what are the things that an entity like World Health Organization should be suggesting. If it realizes that among the things that may work include, maybe urging people to cover their faces with masks, urging people to stay away from each other, that is a solution. Now it's up to the different countries to figure out how can they adapt those measures to fit them. The United Nations is not going to come to each country in the world and suggest specific solutions to global problems. So I think, again, that is where we expect too much of an organization. It is practically impossible for the United Nations to come out with COVID strategies for its 193 plus countries.
Thank you, sir. I bring back now on the platform Professor Edu Abegano. Professor Edu Abegano. Yes.
Let me add to what Dr. Bongen said about COVID. COVID-19 is a virus. It's a disease. A disease does not make any distinction of culture, does not need any visa before traveling from to the other. So those measures that are taken in the West can also work in the East and in the African countries, because it's a disease. It's a disease that's caused based on proximity. It's a disease that's caused based on how we hug, how we socialize, and so on and so forth. So regulating our way of socialization will solve the problem. If that can solve that in the West, that can solve problem in Africa also, because it's a disease that's not to do with culture.
But the critics, the critics, and if we move away from COVID-19, talk about democracy.
Yeah, those are different.
In terms of what? Because here's the problem. African heads of state
work based on culture.
Yes,
that one we can.
And I'm going to bring back Dr. Ben Bongang to react to this. African heads of state, they're complaining. They complain that, well, United States, you've been doing this for 300 years. You cannot come to Africa and think that we should achieve the same level of democracy that you have. Point number one. Point number two, our cultures are different. Now, you can't just cut and paste. That's, in essence, the defense that's put up by lots of African heads of state. Do they have a point here, sir?
Yeah.
Kagame has said that many times.
Yeah, they have a point, and they do not have a point also. If something works already, you can learn from people. From our African, if you look at our African leaders, they put and implemented in their place.
We seem to be having connections with Professor Edu. Yes, go ahead, sir.
Experience democracy and have a.
This is Chat Night Africa. Dr. Edu has been fallen off the line. I'm going to bring back Dr. Ben Bongang on the stage. And the question I want to ask him is, Dr. Ben Bongang, when the West pressure developing countries on you have to democratize, you have to. And then leaders of developing countries, especially Kagame, says, no, you just can't tell me what to do. If we're talking about democracy, then you can't tell me what to do. You can criticize me that I've been in power for how long. If the people of Rwanda choose that I be there. So the question again is it international hypocrisy or what?
No, it's not.
Why isn't it?
It's not, because we've been talking at length today about power politics and national interest. If I come to pressure you to change the living standards in your house, you can do it or you may not. But if you know that you will turn to me to ask for some assistance, you might reconsider it, isn't it? If you think about the 1980s, when the World Bank came up with the structural adjustment programs, this was another strategy by an international organization to nudge developing countries to adopt the kinds of economic policies that they thought would be good for the people of those countries. But I can assure you, because I was very intimately interested in that topic, the powers that were pushing this were also thinking of their interests. Because when a country is democratic, what's going to happen? It is going to collaborate with other democracies. So the more democratic countries there are in the world, the more collaboration, the more closer relationships you will have between the older democracies and the new democracies. If we go again back to the Cold War period that I talked about, I think it becomes very clear when you saw, even within one country, if we look like Angola at the time, you had political parties, the MPLA that was closer to the Soviet Union, the FNLA that was closer to the United States, within one country. So the party that prevailed, of course, in leadership will lean towards that country. So that was the reality of it. So when these superpowers, as we want to call some of the European powers, pushing for democracy, they are also pushing for their interests. And democracy, what is it about? It's about giving citizens of countries a voice. How you organize that is up to you. Democracy is a work in progress. Those who live in the United States will realize that after 300 plus years, the United States is struggling with democracy. So there is no end point yet. So that is what it's not like we have to take orders. But if we do not take orders, then what are the alternatives?
This is Chat Night Africa, and I am getting signals from Professor Jacques Kahindo from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Ohio. I am getting signals from him. Dr. Kahindo, you may have to call back again. I thought you were indicating to that. But Dr. Ben Bongang, is the criticism by African leaders that you just can't impose on us?
No.
Our democracy has to go at our pace. Are they right?
African countries are sovereign states. They run their business the way they want. And the others who look at it and criticize are criticizing that what they see is not good. But it doesn't change what you do in your country. It doesn't. So, but the point I'm making is that sometimes the powerful countries have the means to compel some weaker countries to do the things the weaker countries may not want to do. And that is what power is about. If I can compel you to do something that you don't want to do, it means I have power over you, isn't it? And that is and that's the reality of the world that we've been talking about.
Dr. Ben Bongang, we had to do this for 90 minutes. We're slightly at 97 minutes. We've got to go. I know you professors, when people, I mean, you are moving libraries, moving encyclopedias. We could talk on this till tomorrow. What would you say Africans need to do to have a real place in the United Nations? I'm just not talking about having a one country, one vote.
No, Africans countries need to first clean their houses. What do I mean by that? They need to figure out how to run countries and give voices to all the sectors of their population. Build countries in ways that they can be productive. You go to many African countries today, most of them independent since the 1960s. And they are like in the dark ages in terms of development. And at the same time, you see people who are in government, who are not running businesses, living in palaces. So there's something wrong with that picture. So it is not the United Nations or any international organization that is going to solve the African problems. No, African countries will solve their problems if they want to. And most of them have the resources. It's just that they are so mismanaged, and they have to learn to give voices to their citizens.
And do you have a last word, sir?
No, the last word is that international organizations are useful when a country becomes a viable member, meaning if it can carry its weight, whether it is military or economic weight, it will be able to participate fully and will be able to bring about
it seems we have somebody on the line. Let me see if I can get the person. That's a call from Canada. They've been struggling to come in. Let me see if I can take the call. Hello, this is Chat Night Africa. Hello, this is Chat Night Africa. And let me see if I can actually get the person from Canada. Yes, keep going, Dr. Bongang. Let me see.
Yes, I was just
the person is very eager
saying that the role of international organizations, we often call the period after 1945 as the new international order. And that new international order, as we see with the creation of the UN, as we celebrate the 75 years, the question now we have to be asking, is the world ripe for a new international order? And if so, what will be the form of that kind of order? And I think that's the challenge for the world today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ben Bongang. We had Dr. Ben Bongang, a senior scholar in the United States, professor of journalism and political science. We also had Professor Edu Abeganu, of Togolese origin, professor of political science, specialist in international conflict management and peacekeeping, all those things. We had our friend from South Africa, Professor Gabila Fortung, professor of political science at School of Economics, Northwest University in South Africa. Thank you so much, Dr. Ben. It was nice having you one more time at the Chat Night Africa Debate Forum. We appreciate you coming in, sir.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
And before we go, I'm having indications from a Chat Night Africa chief African correspondent, Jerry Johnny, with what I call Africa This Week in the News. Here is our chief correspondent in Africa.
An area of eastern Ghana has declared itself a sovereign state. The region known as Western Togoland has had secessionist attempts in the past. Armed men demanding the cessation of Western Togoland from Ghana blockaded major entry point to the Volta region of Ghana on Friday morning. Newsmen say the group are holding 3 police officers hostage, including a district commander, and attacked 2 police stations. Prior to the blockade, the group reportedly broke into an armory and stole weapons. About 12 hours before Friday's down operation, the Western Togoland Restoration Front published photos of the graduation ceremony for around 500 personnel who underwent training for months in secret locations, raising questions over the effectiveness of security agencies in the region. On September 21, a military court in Cameroon sentenced 4 soldiers to 10 years in prison and 1 other to 2 years for the brutal killing of 2 women and 2 children in 2015. While the sentence breaks the norm of impunity for military abuses, the potential impact of the trial in setting accountability standards was compromised because the trial and sentencing took place behind closed doors and lacked transparency. Guinea's main opposition leader called on neighboring West African states to help to stop a political crisis in Guinea, where President Alpha Condé is running for a 3rd term in the October elections. The 15-nation West African group known as ECOWAS support democracy in the region and has recently praised Mali's junta, who seized power last month, to return the country to civilian rule. Guinea's opposition leader, Gelo Delin Diale, said yesterday that he would like to see the regional body turns its attention to his country. Diallo, who is 68 years, has denounced as unconstitutional Condé's decision to run again in the October 18 elections. This will be the 3rd phase of between Condé and Diallo, who first ran against each other in the country's 2010 election that came after more than a half-century of dictatorship. Guinea's security forces failed to protect people from election-related and intercommunal violence and committed human rights abuses in Nzerokere, southeastern Guinea, during legislative elections and a constitutional referendum in March 2020, Human Rights Watch said in a report released today, Friday, 25th September 2020. The Coalition for Revolution, CORE, the organizers of Revolution Now protests, has announced plans to hold a mass action against poor governance in Nigeria on October 1st, 2020. The group is led by former presidential candidate and Sahara Reporters publisher Omoyele Sowore. The Revolution Now protest, which was first staged in August 5, 2019, and the second edition on the same day this year, held across major cities in Nigeria. However, the peaceful demonstration has been made with a clampdown by security operatives, resulting in arrest and incarceration of many protesters, including the leader of the group, Sowore. In a statement sent to newsmen on Thursday, CORE called on all Nigerians at home and in diaspora to participate in the October 1st protest. From Uyo, Nigeria, I am Jerry Johnny reporting for Chat Night Africa Live.
Thank you, Jerry. Jerry Johnny is our Chief Africa correspondent for Chat Night Africa. And this is where we end this week's edition of Chat Night Africa. And we end on that note. Africa This Week in the News. That has been Chat Night Africa Live. On the show today, Professors Gabila Fortung in South Africa. We had Ben Bonga, senior journalist and political scientist. We also had Professor Edu Abeganu. Chat Night Africa. Thank you for watching. Share this broadcast. Now you understand why the United Nations does what it is or doesn't do what you think it should do. Knowledge is power. If you had an inflated expectation of the United Nations, especially the Security Council, you should perhaps start deflating your expectation now. On Chat Night Africa production, supervisor Dr. B. Tadzong Komunda. Broadcast director Mumbalingwa. And we have our social media platforms manager and video editor, Ze Roger Fool in Lagos. Studio manager, Beat Beatrice Famonen.
Attention.
Production assistants Emmanuel Wagindi, John Tanto, and Lord Benson. Special assistant to the presenter of Chat Night Africa, Daniel Eno. This is Chat Night Africa from Washington, D.C. metropolitan area.
Attention.
Chat Night Africa is compiled and presented by
Attention. Attention.
and my name is Divine Chamuko. Merci à tout le monde. I will see you again at the same time next week. Au revoir. Thank you for watching this seismic broadcast. Love from the fountains of Chat Night Africa.
It's all right here. It's dynamite. I'm ready. I'm coming. I'm coming back. I'm coming back.
I will come back again. Bye-bye.
We're gonna dance. I'm coming.